This is my video on the word simile, and it can be quite handy to know, especially in terms of it being different from metaphor. So if I just draw the definition up here, definition of a simile is a figure of speech used to compare two unlike things, often introduced with the words like, as, or than. Those are the words you're probably going to use if you're doing a simile. But in terms of why it's different from a metaphor, do a line down here, is that with a metaphor you say things like A is B, but with a simile you say A is like B, or A is as big as B. So a simile keeps the things you are comparing distinct. Metaphors tend to blend. So naturally a simile is a louder and more obvious comparison. Because when you're using a simile, it's really obvious that you're comparing the two things. You're saying, listen, A is like B. A is bigger than C. It's so obvious that you're comparing. With a metaphor, you're kind of sneaking it in. You're quietly saying A is B. So the fact that you're doing a comparison at all is kind of a bit secret, almost. So a quick illustration of that is just, here's 5 people each using different similes to describe the same thing. So that's just an example that different people with different perspectives would use different similes, whereas the actual reality underlying it can be just the same thing. But a better way, probably, of remembering what a simile is, if I can just draw a line through there, is if you just remember the etymology. Etymology, which is just where a word comes from. Now with simile, it's a bit boring in terms of where the actual word came from, but its roots tell you everything. So a simile comes from Latin word similis, meaning like. Now that's the boring bit, it's because it's so obvious. Obviously it means like. But the interesting bit is it comes from the same root as similar. So that is just how to remember simile. Just think similar. So a simile is just comparing two things that are similar. Now, another way of thinking about a simile is it is used probably more often in everyday speech compared to a metaphor. So a simile is used more, I'll change colour. A simile is used more often in everyday speech compared to a metaphor. Compared to metaphors. So you often hear things like, he's as fast as lightning, or like a pack of wolves. So if an author's trying to convey real life speech, they might tend to use similes more than metaphors. But if they're doing something poetic, they probably will tend to use more metaphors. So some similes are actually maybe a bit overused. So similes can be, I'll change colour again. Similes can, so you have to watch out a bit. Similes can be overused. And another kind of interesting thing is that they can be wrong. They can be wrong. but still work. So, for example, drunk as a skunk. Drunk as a skunk. Now, that is technically wrong because skunks aren't really known for being drunk too often. But it still works because if I said he's as drunk as a skunk, you'd probably know exactly what I mean pretty quickly. So similes can be overused and they can be wrong, but they can still work. Now, finally, just so you know how it could be used quite easily in a sentence, just a quick example would be the similes in this poem all involve weaponry. This brings up the feeling of violence again and again. So that's a sentence that you might use to describe I'm not thinking of any particular poem, but that's just a way of using the word simile in a sentence, maybe in an answer or in an essay. So just to quickly recap, a simile is a figure of speech used to compare two unlike things, often with the words like, as, or than. So simile keeps the things you are comparing distinct, whereas metaphors tend to blend. A simile is quite an obvious comparison. It's quite loud when you use it. It's very clear that you're comparing. It comes from the same root as similar. It tends to be used more often in everyday speech compared to metaphors. And just finally, similes can be wrong, but even when they're wrong, they can still work. So that's just a very quick overview of what a simile is.